Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Brian. I'm going to start with a confession, if I may. I proposed this title for my talk before I really properly thought it through, and that meant setting myself down a road without knowing quite where it would take me. That's not always the best approach. My basic assumption was that I was looking at part of a subject, church plate, on which I felt reasonably secure. For church plate is normally made of silver, and silver is a precious metal with an intrinsic value. But just occasionally it's made not of silver, but of gold, which is also a precious metal, only more so. The question that I decided to explore, therefore, was whether gold, in the context of the church, was simply upmarket silver, or whether it was fundamentally different. And to get you to the answer, or my answer, I'm going to have to take you down that same road with all its bends and blind alleys that I had to take myself. So let me start with a couple of pretty obvious remarks, just to get the ball rolling. In its most general sense, plate is about status. If it's bought for yourself, it's about your status. But if it's given, it's a bit more complicated. In the secular world, gifts of plate were normally either about settling an obligation or creating one. In other words, about debt or bribery. Take this gold cup, for example. It was made in 1764. It's pretty big and heavy, and it was given, so the inscription tells us, by Lord Lee to one of his trustees upon Lee coming into his inheritance. This is clearly a debt, a thanks for looking after his assets during his formative years. And the reason it's gold is because Lee reckoned that he owed his trustee rather a lot. And this object equated, in his mind anyway, to the value of that debt. In this case, being gold was simply a matter of convenience, because its equivalent value in silver would have amounted practically to a whole dinner service. Bribes don't usually have inscriptions describing them as such, but history is full of accounts that makes it quite clear that both parties were in no doubt about what the gift was all about. Gifts to the church, however, were different. They weren't generally bribes to start with, nor were they settlements of debt, but they were very much about status. And when Sir William Stanhope left his imposing tankard to the parish church of Wing in Buckinghamshire, he had it engraved so that his generosity, and he himself, would be noted and will continue to be noted ever after. But there is a sense in which gifts to the church were much more complicated than secular gifts because they were about different parties. They were about donors, they were about the church, and they were about God. Now we'll come back to that, but let's turn to another role of precious metals first. In addition to status, silver and gold have always played a part in ritual and ceremony. Their beauty, their value, and their perceived sense of purity contributed to a dignified tone that set courtly or religious ceremony apart from ordinary life. Looking to the ancient world, references abound in the Old Testament to gold and silver in the temple in Jerusalem, and at an earlier stage of Jewish history, during the Exodus, God instructed the Israelites, and I quote, to make an ark and overlay it with pure gold, both inside and out, and make a gold moulding around it. The ark, of course, had an immensely important role to contain the tablets of the Ten Commandments that Moses was given directly by God and that he brought down from the mountain. The ark, of course, no longer exists, so I can't show it to you. But here is how Benjamin West saw it, complete with two golden cherubim on the cover that Moses had prescribed. Later, in the same narrative, there is the unfortunate episode of Aaron's golden calf. And you'll recall that while Moses was up the mountain, the people persuaded Aaron to set up a golden calf which they worshipped instead. But this incurred Moses' wrath, not because there was anything improper in the use of gold for religious purposes, but because the calf was an object of idolatry. Moses would doubtless have been equally grumpy about the golden statues of Zeus and Athena that graced the temples in Olympia and Athens, and which were famous throughout the ancient world. Such locked up value, especially on such a massive scale, tends not to survive across the centuries, and nothing like these things survives from the ancient world. But it is significant that some of the earliest Roman silver that has been found in this country bears the Chi Rho and the Alpha and Omega, both Christian motifs, suggesting that they were made for the celebration of the Eucharist. Almost all the greatest surviving medieval silver is religious in one way or another, and the most beautiful of it reminds us of why the art of the goldsmith was held in such very high esteem during the Middle Ages. Indeed, beautifully worked objects made of costly materials, like these from San Marco in Venice, or the cathedral treasuries of Aachen and Cologne, were part of the reason why I had assumed that gold was just a more valuable extension of silver, or silver gilt. But as I started to think specifically about gold in relation to religion, I found myself looking at a subject that is more complex and more multi-layered than I had supposed. And I started to ask whether, in addition to being more costly and exclusive than silver, gold might have some unique quality that sets it apart. And the answers revolve around questions of status and hierarchy, and of symbolism, and of piety. These questions are not entirely easy to keep apart, but let me at least try, and I'm going to start with status and hierarchy. Getting to grips with this question is not made any easier by the fact that most liturgical gold has disappeared. War, evolving theology, theft and confiscation have all between them ensured that almost all the physical evidence for this rich seam in the material history of Christianity has been melted down. And to form any idea at all of the role of gold in the centuries before modern times, we have to rely on other sorts of evidence, on inventories and contemporary accounts. But these are not nearly as dry and colourless as you might think. And if you read them carefully and imaginatively, you can put together a remarkable picture of what existed and what the visual impact of a wealthy medieval church must have been. By and large, the sorts of objects that were made in silver were also sometimes made in gold. But as you might expect, gold was always much rarer than silver. The 1384 inventory of St. George's Chapel in Windsor, for example, the well-endowed collegiate church of the Order of the Garter, lists substantial quantities of silver, but relatively little gold. It includes 7 silver gilt chalices, but just one fine golden chalice set with gemstones. It had many silver gilt altar crosses, and again, only one of gold. More than a century later, the 1520 inventory of the royal plate includes huge quantities of secular gold, but relatively little for the chapel royal. 1 gold chalice in comparison with 15 of silver gilt, 4 gold crosses and crucifixes, but 4 times as many in silver gilt, and 4 golden images compared with 48 in silver. Let's look then a little more closely at what these records might tell us about my first theme, about status and hierarchy. The descriptions of these vanished objects show that the designs of sacred plate in gold were, in general terms, quite similar to those in silver gilt, but in one respect, gold was different and that is that it was often embellished with gems, partly to establish a kind of visual hierarchy and to emphasize the preciousness of the golden objects. An example of this from the secular world was the plate used at a banquet of Francis I in France, where vessels were used by the king and queen, which were described as of gold set with beautiful jewels. These were obviously stupendous, and perhaps a little bit like these. The French Royal Gold Cup of about 1400 in the British Museum, and the late 15th century Gold and Rock Crystal Cup of Philip the Good in Vienna. And these stood in marked contrast to those used by other people at the top table, which was said to be of gold but without any jewels, and indeed to the silver gilt that everybody else had to put up with. A spectacular example of the same phenomenon in a religious context is the magnificent gold chalice made for Cardinal Albrecht of Brandenburg in about 1520. Miraculously, this chalice survives, and it's in the treasury of Uppsala Cathedral. It is completely unchanged from its beautiful and precise illustration in the wonderful inventory of Albrecht's treasury. This is the absolute non plus ultra of Gothic chalices. And yet, if you strip away the rich embellishments, what you're left with is the standard conventional form of its time. But Albrecht's chalice is transformed into something almost unbelievable through its astonishing array of exquisitely set sapphires, rubies, pearls, and other precious stones. Turning back to Francis I's banquet and the distinction between the royal and the not quite royal gold vessels, we might compare Albrecht's chalice of massive gold with beautiful jewels with another, made in England in 1507 for Bishop Richard Fox. Fox bequeathed it to his Oxford College, Corpus Christi, and it's the earliest surviving piece of English hallmarked gold anywhere. It is a great treasure by any standards, but it's not in the same league as Albrecht's. But then Albrecht was a cardinal and Fox a mere bishop. It's the same sort of hierarchical difference that is displayed around Francis I's table. Were the cardinal and bishop seeking, through their gold chalices, to glorify God, or their office, or themselves? Well, that we cannot say, but perhaps all three. But gold certainly played a role in dignifying rank. The elevated status of the greatest clergy was an important feature of the medieval world. Before the Reformation, the Church was the one truly international institution in Europe and a significant check to the power of the crown. For Fox himself was a consummate politician who would have been well aware of the fine line between being a prince of the Church and a servant of the crown. But as Bishop of Winchester, he presided over the richest diocese in England. His status and that of other great bishops was important, and it was expressed in part through the visible trappings of worldly wealth. These were the same as those of other great nobles: palaces, jewels, cupboards of precious plate, fine tapestries, and so on, as well as large households of retainers. But such trappings spilled over into their clerical persona too. Gold, as a mark of ecclesiastical rank, included, as well as sumptuous altar plate, a range of insignia and other personal items of adornment. Cardinal Wolsey, cardinal note, not bishop, always processed with 2 gold crosses as a token of his legatine rank. And here he is, setting out from Hampton Court with the crosses carried before him. And that they really were gold is evidenced by the surviving entry in his goldsmith's account, which reads, "Item, for the plus of the gold," in other words, the extra gold, "that went in to refurbish the 2 crosses for my Lord's grace, made of fine gold, one garnished with stone and pearl." More standard episcopal items were bishops' rings and pectoral crosses. Then there were morses, gold and jewel-encrusted mitres and croziers. Quite a few rings and pectoral crosses survive because they were personal and they were often buried with their owners, along with small chalices. One of the greatest relics of the early medieval period is the garnet-set gold cross that was interred with St. Cuthbert when he was buried at Durham in 687. And in Holbein's portrait of Archbishop Wareham, we can see the aging prelate's pearl-encrusted mitre and his splendid gold enamelled and jewel-set processional cross. There they are in closer detail. A major use of gold that we tend to overlook was the cloth of gold and gold thread embroidery that made up the finest vestments. They're very rare from the Middle Ages, and along with rich medieval and Renaissance tapestries, most, shocking though it may sound to us, were burned in later centuries in order to melt out and extract the gold. But a sense of their splendour is evoked by a royal cope from the reign of Henry VII, preserved at Stonyhurst College. This is embroidered with Tudor symbols and depictions of saints in a sumptuous ground of cloth of gold. And there it is closer up. But the subject of vestments, brings me to my second theme, namely symbolism. Vestments had a human and a divine aspect. As trappings of men, they were marks of status, but their priestly role points to a separate strand in the complex weave of church gold. In celebrating Mass, the priest was instrumental in the miracle of transforming the bread and wine into the real body and blood of Christ, and the radiant gold of his vestments played an important role in symbolizing God's majesty. The Middle Ages were a period in which religion pervaded all aspects of life and in which the worlds of church and court were closely entwined, two parallel universes, as it were. It would have been surprising if the visibility of gold and silver in the one should not have been matched in the other. But despite the regular wrangles of kings and bishops, the merging of these two worlds is seen on many levels, such as the quasi-religious character of much court ceremonial, the formalized ablution before dining, the ritualistic service of drink, and the role of the great salt, salt being, of course, a biblical symbol of purity, were all aspects of an almost Eucharistic quality to ceremonial dining. Compare depictions of medieval royal dining with those of the Last Supper, and you'll see almost the same thing in the latter as in the former. Not at all the austere simplicity of the Gospel accounts. This merging of secular and religious was at its most significant in the institution of the monarchy itself. For while the king embodied secular authority, the concept of kingship was sacred, and the right to the crown might be inherited or might be won on the battlefield, but it was formally conferred through the coronation, which was conducted by the church and symbolized by the regalia. Something of the majesty, but also the sacramental nature of the ceremony is suggested perhaps in the coronation portrait of Richard II. Now, it was unthinkable that the regalia should not have been of gold, for not only was it the richest and most desirable of materials, but its purity and incorruptibility symbolized the very qualities to which a virtuous prince should aspire. Nor was gold restricted to the crown jewels themselves. The robes, heavy with cloth of gold and gold embroidery, implied a priestly quality to kingship by recalling, but transcending, clerical vestments. The mystical significance of the regalia is expressed in Elizabeth I's reign by Sir John Fern in his book Blazon of Gentry. This was written in 1586, nearly 30 years after her coronation. And Fern writes that, and I quote, "The crown set on her head is of gold to signify her excellent majesty. In this triumphant crown of our sovereign lady there be placed, to signify the princely virtues of a king, 12 gems or stones of precious esteem." Fern recounts the specific meaning with which each of these materials was invested. Gold represents wisdom, emerald, justice, sapphire, continence, and so on. Now, as it happens, the regalia depicted in this portrait is the state regalia, which was distinct from the coronation regalia. The state regalia was kept in the jewel house and was at the disposal of the monarch, whereas the coronation regalia was used only once and was kept at Westminster Abbey. All of the regalia were, of course, destroyed during the Commonwealth, but we know exactly what the coronation crown, the so-called crown of Edward the Confessor, looked like, because it was described in Henry VIII's inventory and depicted in Daniel Myton's portrait of Charles I. And it's embellished not only with jewels, but with crosses and cameos of Christ, the Virgin and Child, and St. George. Not much less important was the ecclesiastical regalia, the plate that dressed the altar and was used during the coronation ceremony. In the medieval regalia, this too was of gold and included an altar cross, a chalice, and ampulla, the vessel that was used to contain the holy oil. The ampulla was particularly important. Regal authority stemmed from being the anointed of the Lord, as Israel's King David had been, and unction, the act of anointment, was at the heart of the coronation ritual. You'll remember that was the part that was so, as it were, sacred that it took place in the recent coronation behind a special screen. Other than the 12th century anointing spoon, the only pre-Commonwealth item to survive is the plain gold ampulla that was made for the Scottish coronation of Charles I in 1633. From Charles II's coronation in 1660, we then have the gold chalice and paten and ampulla, which is in the form of an eagle. Well, it would not be too far-fetched to call this attitude a theology of gold. And indeed, in the mid-12th century, Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis attempted to articulate this very idea in his tract De Administratione. Head of the great Royal Benedictine Abbey outside Paris, Suger argued that gold and precious stones reflected the glory of God and gave the faithful a vision of his perfection. He said as much in the inscription he placed on the lavishly gilded bronze doors to the church. And the inscription goes like this: "All you who seek to honour these doors, marvel not only at the gold and expense, but at the craftsmanship. The noble work is bright, but being nobly bright, the work should brighten the minds, allowing them to travel through the lights to the true light, where Christ is the true door. The dull mind rises to the truth through material things and is resurrected from its former submersion when the light is seen." Now, there are a lot of complicated ideas going on here. Nobility, Christology, resurrection, and all triggered by right craftsmanship and right materials. In similar vein, he wrote of the effigy, of the effect, rather, of the great golden altar cross on his own perceptions. The cross no longer survives, but it's known from a 15th century painting of the miraculous Mass of St. Giles and from the 18th century engraving. And this is what he wrote about it. "Sometimes," he wrote, "sometimes the multicoloured loveliness of the gems has called me away from external cares, worthy meditation, transporting me from material to immaterial things, has persuaded me to examine the diversity of holy virtues, when I seem to see myself existing on some level, as it were, beyond our earthly one, neither completely in the slime of earth, nor completely in the purity of heaven. There was another string to Suger's bow, and that concerned gold as the ideal material for the chalice, because it symbolized the divine nature of its contents. To me, he wrote, it has always seemed right that the most expensive things should be used above all for the administration of the Holy Eucharist. If golden vessels, vials, and mortars were used to collect the blood of bulls and goats, he's referring there, of course, to Old Testament sacrifices, how much more should gold vessels, precious stones, and whatever else is most valuable among created things be set out with continual reverence and devotion to receive the blood of Jesus Christ. Suger's gold chalice no longer survives, but the jewelled and silver-gilt mounted chalice from Saint Denis that is preserved in the National Gallery of Art in Washington gives us an idea of his vision. On the strength of these convictions, Suger created at Saint Denis one of the greatest medieval treasuries of the medieval world. But magnificent though these treasures were, they were not assembled as vain objects of envy, but as exemplar that would move the spirit to contemplate higher things. The altar at Saint Denis contained the remains of Saint Denis himself, and reminds us that some of the most spectacular goldsmith's work of the Middle Ages was inspired by the cult of relics. Saintly relics were the great how to spend it of medieval Europe. The most sought after of these were of Christ himself and the body parts of the greatest saints. There were, of course, no relics of Christ's resurrected body, and his relics were restricted to things that he had come into contact with: the cross, the nails, the crown of thorns, the shroud, and so on. These trophies were bought and sold for enormous sums, and it was de rigueur to provide them with magnificent containers. Such utterly holy objects tended to be provided with gold casings embellished with jewels and enamels, like the great thorn reliquary in the British Museum, made for the Duc de Berry in about 1400. Here, the thorn itself sits at the centre of the reliquary, designed as a miniature altarpiece, with the thorn issuing from a precious sapphire and rising across the enamelled figures of Christ in majesty, surrounded by a choir of angels and standing above a depiction of the resurrection of the dead, with God the Father seated above all in judgment. It is, in effect, a complete theology of the last things. Most reliquaries of such preciousness survive only as inventory descriptions, but the the Holy Thorn reliquary is not entirely alone, and another is one given by Charles the Bold to Liège Cathedral in 1467. This is made in the form of the kneeling figure of the donor, shown presenting the relic of St. Lambert, and presented in turn by his helmet-doffing patron saint, St. George himself. The most famous of all relics were the shrines that contained the whole body of a saint, and the most venerated in England were those of Thomas Becket at Canterbury and St. Edmund at Bury. These were destinations of pilgrimages from all over Europe, and this image shows Henry VI praying at the gilded and bejewelled shrine of St. Edmund. But they were also, these shrines, an important source of income. And then, as now, tourism was a major contributor to local economies. The incentive for such pilgrimages, often undertaken at great cost, was the pious hope of spiritual gain or a cure for some debilitating condition. And we see in this painting a more typical class of pilgrim, poor, sick, and maimed, reaching up to touch the tomb and draw down some of its spiritual charge. I think it's an amazing painting. The odds in favour of saintly intercession, of course, were greatly improved by the gift of some jewel or some other ornament to embellish the shrine. And Erasmus's account of his visit to Canterbury in 1514 gives a vivid impression of how rich great shrines could be. He describes his experience as seeing a coffin of wood covering a coffin of gold, which being drawn up by ropes and pulleys, this is a modern artist's impression of what Erasmus saw, which being drawn up by ropes and pulleys, an invaluable treasure was discovered. Gold was the meanest thing to be seen there. All that shone and glittered were the rarest and most precious jewels of an extraordinary bigness. Some were larger than the egg of a goose. And when this sight was shown, the prior, with white wand, touched every jewel, one by one, you can see him doing it, one by one, telling the name, the value, and the donor of it. At the other end of the spectrum, physically, very small relics could be of a much more personal nature, carried around on the person as an amulet in a jewel. One such is probably to be seen in Holbein's portrait of Henry VIII, suspended around his neck on a gold chain. And because they were small, they were often made of gold. And because they were carried around, they were occasionally lost. The Middleham jewel, a 15th century diamond-shaped pendant engraved with the Trinity and the Nativity and set with a sapphire, may also once have contained a relic. It was found, incidentally, with a metal detector at Middleham in Yorkshire in 1985, and it must have been lost when it was still quite new. Personal also was that other great genre of medieval art, the illuminated Book of Hours. These wonderfully concentrated devotional aids were occasionally bound in jewelled or enamelled gold, such as this example of 1542 in the British Museum. Then there were the veneration of images. We tend to think of these in terms of frescoes, panel paintings, stained glass, sculpture in stone, ivory, or wood. But the goldsmith was a major provider of images too, made either as pure sculpture, to be venerated like an icon, or as the housing for relics. This slide shows two late medieval silver and silver gilt images, both of which were reliquaries. A very rare surviving one of the Virgin Mary, now in the Kimball Art Museum in Texas, and a depiction from one of Cardinal Albrecht's inventory images. But the most splendid were of gold, embellished with enamel and jewels. One of Henry VIII's most precious golden images was of St. George, patron saint of England, which weighed 101 ounces and was described as standing on a base of silver and gilt. So the image was gold, the base silver and gilt, with a maiden, and under St. George's feet, a dragon of silver. The description goes on to enumerate precious stones, pearls, and an ostrich feather on the saint's helmet. But the essential fact is that there was a symbolic hierarchy within the object itself. Gold for St. George himself, and silver gilt for the support cast. Nothing like this survives, although one can perhaps get an idea of its sumptuousness from the amazing St. George reliquary of about 1600 that is preserved in the Schatzkammer in Munich. Further visual analogies can be taken from two of the depictions of golden images in Albrecht's inventory. One smothered in pearls and gems, and the other a golden crucifix embellished with rich enamels and obviously valuable precious stones. Just as the notion of status was linked with symbolism, so they were both linked with piety. And this is the third of our strands in the story of gold and godliness. The church, as we know, was a staggeringly wealthy institution and collectively had the means to be a great patron of goldsmiths. But many of its treasures came not by purchase, but by gift. The enlightened self-interest of a prince called for balance between conspicuous consumption and magnanimity. And being seen as a pious son of the church was an important part of a king's image, and one of its channels was costly gifts to the church. The famous Abbey of Grandmont in southwest France, for example, had a great treasury, which was partly the result of gifts over the years from the English Plantagenet kings. We used to own that part of France, you may remember. Abbot Suger himself describes how the golden altar frontal at Saint-Denis was augmented and enriched with gifts of princes and wealthy pilgrims. And he writes that into this panel we have set around 42 marks of gold and a rich abundance of precious gems. You would see kings and princes and many outstanding men imitating us, remove the rings from their fingers and order that the gold, gems and precious pearls of the rings be set in the panel. Well, by the middle of the 16th century, much of this world, in Northern Europe at least, came to an abrupt end. With the triumph of the Reformation, many of the attitudes that had underpinned Abbot Suger's thinking were swept away. The rejection of transubstantiation and the intercession of saints negated the theological justification of such costly golden paraphernalia. Indeed, to the more radical elements of the new Protestant faith, such as the followers of Calvin and Zwingli, images, relics, and costly vessels were seen not only as superfluous, but as invitations to idolatry that had no place in Christian worship. They had to go. In England, the chalice changed abruptly from this to this. And a sense of the cataclysmic impact of these changes is conveyed in this woodcut, a very famous woodcut from Fox's Book of Martyrs, in which this clean-out is portrayed with a sense of celebration. Look at the little captions. "The temple well purged. Ship over your trinkets and be packing, ye papists." And there at the bottom you can see the papists packing away their poultry. Not chickens, that is to say, but poultry items. Radical theology was not the only reason for rooting out gold from the church. Politics played a part too. Just a few years after Erasmus's visit to Canterbury, Henry VIII took against the cult of St. Thomas, and he ordered the destruction of all images of the saint throughout the land, and he had the shrine of Canterbury dismantled and appropriated its treasure. This was only part of a much wider-ranging campaign that saw the destruction of sacred gold and silver in England on a scale so great that it's virtually erased our sense that it ever existed. Our best clue to the extent of the pre-Reformation holdings of the English Church is gained from the stark reports of the Tudor commissioners who toured the monasteries, gathering up their precious trinkets. In the 1530s, in 1537, just under 9 tons of precious metal, 9 tons of precious metal were harvested from the monasteries, of which some 200,000 ounces were reported as silver and 14,000 as gold. Accounts of what was yielded up by some of the cathedrals gives a slightly clearer sense of the kinds of treasures that were lost. Lincoln, for example, Lincoln Cathedral's holdings had included a cross of gold standing on 4 lion feet and containing relics of the true cross. It also included 2 massive gold candlesticks weighing 450 ounces each and described as standing on 4 great feet with 20 buttresses of gold and having a great knop. Dissent, though, from Abbot Suger's view was not new. Even in his own time, it had been famously challenged by St. Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian theologian, who argued that locking up such valuable economic resources in precious gold and silver plate was contrary to one of the church's primary missions, which was to alleviate poverty. And here they are, Abbot Suger holding one of his bronze doors and Bernard praying to the Virgin and Child. The St. Bernard image is from a stone boss in a church in Herefordshire that I saw just the other day. The label says probably St. Bernard, but for today's purposes, it is St. Bernard. But in many ways, Bernard was out of kilter with his time, and it wasn't until the 16th century that his views came of age. In Protestant countries, much of the symbolism and concern for hierarchy drained out of sacred gold, leaving only piety as a recognizable motif for its place in the church. In Roman Catholic countries, to be sure, sumptuous and sophisticated gold plate continued to be made for the greatest cathedrals and abbeys, and as recently as 2006, an astonishing group of jewelled and enamelled gold objects made around 1600 was discovered at the monastery of Einsiedeln in Switzerland. But in England, the situation was very different. It's fair to say that in post-Reformation England, there was no theological presumption against gold, and yet it is extremely rare. What survives from the 17th and 18th centuries, apart from the chalices in the royal collection that we've looked at already, are 3 communion cups and an early 17th century secular cup that was given to Stapleford Church by the Earl of Harborough in 1732. And the motive for each gift, as far as we can tell, seems to have been simply piety. The earliest of the communion cups is the one bequeathed to Clare College, Cambridge, in 1618 by Dr. William Butler. He left £260 for the commission and stipulated that it should be made of the purest and finest gold that can be found. It is, in fact, around 23 carat, and it weighs 85 ounces. The cup and its pattern are austerely plain, and the Latin inscription, as specified in Butler's will, makes no reference at all to the donor, only that the gift should be, in Latin, in testimony of Christian faith. Why should Butler have chosen gold as the medium for his gift? Presumably because, like Lord Lee, who you'll remember, his cup that we looked at the beginning of this talk, for no other reason than that he wished his bequest to be substantial, but compressed into relatively small dimensions. Another of these cups was given to the parish church of Welshpool in 1662 by Thomas Davis, former Procurator General in West Africa. It's at 32 ounces, it's smaller than Butler's. The inscription records that it is to be made of the purest Guinea gold, but states that the gift was because he had not succumbed to any of the tropical diseases that carried off so many early colonial officers. It was, in other words, a votive offering in the medieval tradition. One might be forgiven for suspecting that the piety of these gifts was tempered by a degree of self-interest. Butler may not have engraved his name, but he can hardly have expected such munificence to have been quickly forgotten, while Davis had his coat of arms conspicuously engraved in addition to the inscription. But one final example, a piece from our own time, can leave one in no such doubts. The gold chalice of 1958 in Liverpool's Metropolitan Cathedral is of a fine and strikingly original design. It was made by Dunstan Pruden, who had trained under Eric Gill, and the Romanesque echoes of its relief figure of Christ in Majesty recalls the distinctive style of his master's woodcuts and sculpture. But the real interest of the chalice, from our point of view, lies not in its design or workmanship, but in the extraordinary story of its origins. For the metal it's made of was provided by 300 gold wedding rings donated for the purpose. And the Latin inscription on its base reads, "Pray for those of whose rings this chalice is made." Well, to draw this lecture to a conclusion, the world of gold and religion is indeed complex and multi-layered. For some, the use of wonderfully crafted and sumptuous vessels in the service of God is deeply meaningful and appropriate. For others, it's a profligate to the point of offensiveness. The question I asked at the outset, does gold in a religious context have some unique quality that sets it apart from other materials, is only partly answered, because in most cases we can only speculate as to the motives behind its choice. Another question, were these hugely costly objects made to glorify God or man, remains. And the answer to that must surely be, in some cases one and in others the other. Gold, even more than silver, is a strange mirror of the history of the Church. Some objects, such as those commissioned by Abbot Suger, suggest a deeply felt theology. Others, like the great shrines of Canterbury and Bury and the golden reliquaries of Charles the Bold and the Duke de Berry, evoke a faith in the efficacy of relics that is perhaps strange to modern eyes. Accidental losses, rediscovered centuries later, like the Middleham jewel, speak of a profound private devotion, no less palpable in spite of the anonymity of the original owner. Anonymous, too, are the donors of the 300 wedding rings, the widow's mites, as it were, which pooled together to make a permanent and touching testimony to collective faith and generosity. And against all of these treasures that survive, there are the countless hundreds that don't, testimonies themselves of the conflicts and shifting beliefs that have been a constant backdrop to the history of the Church, as well as to the perpetual recyclability of gold. Just pause and think for a moment. The gold in the finger on your ring, did it come from a mine in Brazil or Russia? Or might it perhaps be in its nth incarnation, having been successively part of an 18th century gold cup, a 16th century coin, a 14th century reliquary, and who knows, even an ancient British talk. But of course, you'll never know. To quote from Tom Stoppard's constant refrain in Shakespeare in Love, it's a mystery. Thank you.